It's a pleasure to be here at the Index Festival. We are invited to talk a little bit about the concept of coexistence, seeking to establish relationships between technology, democracy, and freedom, where the former reveals itself simultaneously as both nourishment and constraint for the later two. And for this, I would like to present you the two guests we have here, Gustavo Cardoso and Nikolas Leontopoulos. And you will correct my accent, Nikolas, because my Greek isn't
perfect.
Thank you. Nikolas and Gustavo were two very important contributors to something I did in the past years, which was a journalistic research about disinformation and all the problems involved in the new era for information in our societies. And the funny fact is that Nikolas and Gustavo have very different starting points for this debate, which is the richness of the talk I hope we have today. Gustavo is a sociologist, he's a professor, and he was the founder of the first Portuguese research academic group for disinformation. He also deals with important things like the Observatory for Communication, etc. But we will talk about that later on. And especially his starting point in this subject, which is probably the most important one for me now, which is the way communication and information have changed in the last years. I think Gustavo will start from an optimistic point of view, and Nikolas is also with me, one of the co-founders of Investigate Europe. He also founded a very important journalistic project in Greece called Reporters United. And Reporters United, for those who didn't follow it, has been in very different and important in this case law processes in Greece, especially because they were targeted not only by the Greek government in a very important scandal that we should talk about today, which is the Predator scandal in Greece. So journalists were targeted by the Greek government and were surveilled in a non-legal way during their research about important stories like the asylum seeker stories in Greece. And that's the context for our talk today. So we would like to touch all these important subjects and being, of course, in the scope of what Index wants to talk about, which is exactly this relationship between technology and information, democracy, and freedom. And we are doing this right now in Portugal when celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Portuguese Revolution, which, among other important things, brought us freedom of speech and freedom of press. And we are celebrating these 5 decades of freedom of speech and freedom of press, while in the recent days or recent weeks, we've been witnessing important developments regarding the scope of that freedom. I am talking for example, about the way in the United States and how the Congress is debating the opportunity to nationalize in a private way TikTok, or the way we see in Brazil Elon Musk criticizing Lula's government regarding the nominations for the Supreme Court and the retaliation from the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, which decided recently to cut all advertisement for X. And these are important subjects in our talk. And another, for example, what happened recently, 2 or 3 days ago in Germany, when a group of people that were trying to debate well, the war in Gaza, they were basically prevented from doing so, and some of them were actually banned from even trying to do online speeches or recording videos, etc. So there was a ban in Germany recently on what we call freedom of speech and freedom of press, motivated, of course, by many important things. Our advantage in this talk is that we are not polarizing, so we may have different views, and surely we will have different views, but we can still work them together in a very nice talk. So thank you both for being here with me. And Gustavo, I would like to start with you regarding this celebration in Portugal. So the importance of this celebration, and how do you see these recent events in that view? So do you think there is a problem of free speech right now in our world?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nikolas, for having this conversation today. Well, first, I would argue that we are always fighting for the freedom of speech. And so I think it's not about having a negative or a positive view. We are always struggling with the need to broaden freedom of speech. And we are doing that. The great difference is that we are doing it in a world where we communicate differently. You asked me about 50 years ago in Portugal, the revolution. Yes, we had a dictatorship, then we had a democracy. And what happened in that process, as usually happens when you seek freedom, like we did 50 years ago, you look at what existed and you change it. So we changed from censorship to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and that was it. From that moment onwards, we tried to develop a system that would, from one side, enhance democracy practices, from the other side, that tried to create a new balance between the triangle that existed in policy, which is journalists, politicians, and citizens. And we kept on improving it until the moment when things actually changed, because communication tends to change when people have new technologies and they decide to use them differently from the previous. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and probably we'll get there. But what happened around the turning of the century was that we were suddenly in a world where mediation was no longer just on the hands of journalists. So there was the beginning of a huge process of disintermediation. It doesn't mean that there are not new intermediaries in the process. They exist. So we moved from a triangle to a square, adding on the platforms in that process. And we changed the nature of our communication. We moved from mass communication to network communication. That's the place where we live now, under a world that lives with network communication. We have not lost mass communication and journalism. They do exist, but they coexist with another plethora of different ways to communicate, all of them articulated. And that is the big difference. We can say that the big democratizing process that happened, but this is between commas, then we will have to discuss, was that we brought citizens into the process. They became distributors of information, because network communication does not work without people sharing whatever they do receive. In that process, they can change it. They do remix when they don't agree with whatever they receive. And we also brought in platforms in that process. Of course, this means a different world in terms of classification of information, in terms of the production of information, in terms of the distribution of information. Everything tends to change. And I would argue that this was a huge revolution, a so big revolution as the one we had with Gutenberg's press. But not because of people being the producers, because people became also the authorities and no longer just journalists. It's a little bit like when we moved from the Roman Catholic Church that had the authority to say what is the good interpretation of the Bible, to a world where it's no longer just journalists that have to deal with the factual reality. People tend to individualize authenticity because they also move into that process. So disinformation overall is a consequence of the change in communication that we adopt. We adopted it, we were not forced to do it, but that raises a lot of issues, and those are about new forms of censorship, what are the limits of classification of information, is the system that we are building also evolving at the same time with the needed guarantees for citizens, and a whole new world opens up to discuss. And also a world, because we are talking about communication, is a world where power is challenged by citizens, but also by other powers, political powers, economic powers. And once again, we are in this fight for freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So I'm optimistic in the sense that we are always changing. It doesn't mean that along the way we won't change for the worst instead of the better. But well, of course, this has to do with other things. We live very short lives, and if we are talking about a change for the worst that will last for 50 years, I will be dead in that process. So I will be witnessing something good and something going bad, and it will be the next generation that probably will have the ability to change it again for the better. And I end up my starting point with this. It was a lot.
No, thank you, Gustavo. Nikolas, you have been witnessing in the past years, and I will ask you to describe a little bit the situation with Reporters United, if you want. But the problem here is that now we have two very powerful sources that are preventing free speech. Am I interpreting you right on this? So on one side we have disinformation seen as an hybrid warfare, which limits the access to people, to citizens, to all kinds of information. And the other one is the proprietary algorithm decision-making that the platforms use to graduate, to evaluate, or to devaluate the information that goes on social media, which is, by the way, the place where people get most of the information right now, nowadays, more than television, more than, well, whatever. Do you see it like that?
Yes, first of all, Paulo, thank you very much for the invitation. I really feel honored. And as you know, this is such a passionate subject for me that I'm very happy that we are having this discussion, even if we don't agree in everything. But I should start by agreeing with Professor Cardoso, because this is a fact that things have changed over the last decades. Things have changed in technology has changed things, and the consequence of that was, of course, in the way we are consuming information and exchanging information and all that. I agree. My potential disagreement would start that we should, that there is a need to understand what has changed and to adapt ourselves in the change. There's no doubt about that. But then we should keep our principles when we decide measures in order to understand the new state of things. And replying to what you said, for me, some historical context here is important, because the change has been there for many years, but the big change when it comes to freedom of speech and to the so-called fight for disinformation has an historical background. And actually, we were both reporting on that, Paulo, if you remember, back in 2016. It is around 2016 where this new trend of the fight for against disinformation starts. And it's not a coincidence, because we have two huge political events that happened there. And those are the victories of Trump in the US election and the victory of Brexit in the UK. And I can understand the reaction. These are, let's say, two very negative results for our world of liberal thinking, etc. and people think that there should be a way to counter those results. And this is when the whole fight for disinformation starts, against disinformation. Back then, I was ambivalent. I could see the urge to fight disinformation. I could see that potentially foreign powers, for example, could intervene in Western elections. I could see the threat of, for example, of the far right culturing and developing hate speech in the platforms, and that this was completely unregulated and this would spread lies. I could see all those concerns, but I could also see the threat. And now, 8 years later, I have a mostly dark opinion about what has happened. In my opinion, the so-called fight for disinformation is just another word to say censorship. And actually, it's quite telling for me that over those years, the debate we're having today is a big exception. That because most of the time, when you see the news, when you see the platforms, when you see the academic debates, the word that prevails is disinformation. It's not freedom of speech. It's not freedom of expression. But for me, this is just another word to say the same thing. And what happened over those 8 last years, what happened by saying we fight against disinformation, it was just a veiled attempt to restrict free speech. And of course, there is no need for me to say in this forum why restricting free speech is extremely dangerous for democracy, for journalism, for creativity, for so many reasons. I could understand the urge to regulate. There was always regulation, and there's always going to be regulation, but we had big problems in the way we did the regulation. We have now, in Western liberal democracies, the governments themselves regulating free speech, the governments themselves deciding which media outlet is allowed to broadcast and which is not. And the second pillar, of course, of intervening in the free speech is the corporate pillar, the platforms, big tech. And what is even more upsetting to me is that as we now know, those two pillars, they don't act independently. We didn't know it for years, but we now know that the governments themselves are intervening in the platforms and are asking, probably not asking, but dictating to the platforms what kind of content they are going to remove from the platforms. The way they do it is very problematic because we don't even know that this content is being removed. There is an algorithm, for example, that operates in a way that we have no idea about it. The platforms will say this is a commercial secret, so we cannot know how the algorithm works. There is, to give just an example, the so-called shadow banning, where the platforms are filtering accounts and content because they think it's not lawful. And of course, so many questions. Who is deciding? What is the how did they get assigned the legitimacy to be gatekeepers of truth? What are their ties to the government? What are their ties to intelligence agencies? Because we know that this is happening. So these are some of my concerns about the way that this debate has been developing over the last years. And to add a small thing, because you mentioned our experience in Greece with Reporters United, well, one of the big stories that we did in the last 2 years was the surveillance story, that the government in Greece was surveying not just journalists, but generals of the army, politicians, ministers, businessmen, businesswomen, and all that. Actually, also in Greece, it's the 50th anniversary from the fall of dictatorship. So I completely sympathize and empathize with you, and it's a very similar situation. Our experience in Greece over those 2 years is that you have the problem that I try to explain with freedom of speech, but now you have 2 extra problems. One is that massive surveillance changes the way people think because they are afraid they might be surveyed, because they don't trust their phones, they don't trust their computers, which means not only that they are surveyed, but they are afraid to freely express themselves over the phone, over email, etc., which again for me is a big problem. And the second problem, of course, is legal, that more and more we have legal assaults, the so-called slaps, strategic lawsuits against journalism because of their reporting. So of course, the slaps and the surveillance cannot not be compared to the problem with the platforms and the restriction of free speech. But for us journalists, I think it's also an important problem to raise.
Thank you, Nikolas. Gustavo, following up on this, I saw you taking notes. What do you think regulation was able to achieve during this period, and do you think we need extra regulation regarding this problem?
Okay, Paul, do you mind me just returning to some of the things that Nikolas made me think about and then moving on to the regulation?
Just justifying my place here.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I would like also to put on discussion here is the idea that disinformation and the focus on disinformation also has other dangers. And those dangers, they tend to be targeting what we already knew in academia about how people relate themselves with information. There are two ideas. They might not be the ones that we want to listen to, but I think that we need to discuss them because they are of importance. The first is that when we look at this binary relation between information and disinformation, we tend to be talking about news versus another thing that we are calling disinformation. In reality, we know that many people don't look for news actually. They don't look for factual analysis of reality. They look for information that confirms their own biases. And this is something that we know for a long time. We also know, and this is the important part, that in order for democracies to work, we need to counter that perspective that all of us tend to live with. It doesn't mean that you are a journalist or a professor. You many times would wish that actually you are reading not what you are reading, you are not seeing what you are seeing, you're not listening what you are listening, because that tends to confront your own perception, your own views of the world, and you usually tend to agree with the ones that go into whatever you think and not those that go against what you think. But democracies, in order to be strong, in order to foster freedom of speech, they need also for people to look for information in the factual sense of it, not just whatever opinion I have about something. But humanity has always had this trend towards looking for that biases also. So this is something that we need to bring into the discussion. The second thing, also within what we know in terms of academia, is that when we are looking at information, there is also a danger, which is to make us think that there is a cause-effect process in everything. That is, if someone says that Trump is a good person, you will believe it. If someone says that Trump is a bad person, you will believe it. Things don't work like that. We know for over half a century's research that the way in which we look into information, news particularly, doesn't mean that everyone is going to actually acknowledge the same things when receiving those kinds of information. So there are no cause-effects processes, although when combined with what we are saying previously, is that if we are looking for a biased position, if that biased position appears, I will say, okay, then I was right about what I was thinking on something. So disinformation also makes us less prone to, and yet I agree with Nikolas from this perspective, less prone to look for freedom of speech. Because actually we are told, look, people are machines. When they do receive something saying that this is like this, they actually believe it immediately. It's not like that. It's much more complex. And we know that from democracies. Dictatorships, they wish that things would happen like that because they would say everything is good and people will believe it. But even then, we know it's not the truth because it has to do with what you know about reality, the degree of knowledge that you have about a particular subject, And all that counts into this process. So it's a little bit more complex, but I agree that this information actually tells us that the world is very simple. There is only black and white, right or wrong. There are no shadows in between, and the world is made of gray and shadows and not bright and dark in the process. So this is something that I wished also to bring into the discussion. About regulation, the process of how things have been evolving. We actually don't have an idea still about how to regulate everything. So this has been what we can say about what happened during the last 20 years is that regulation has been way behind experimental approaches by platforms, and we have been trying to answer to things that already have happened. For a long time, regulation, for instance, in Europe, meant that you would use the area of the European Union that deals with commercial relations and with all the kinds of companies and put fines on them in order to protect something that had more to do with freedom of speech than actually commercial practices. We are now in a world where we don't know exactly how, for instance, DSA is going to act, but looking at just regulation from this narrow perspective probably is not the best approach. We had a regulation for a world of mass communication that had usually governments and journalists and also media companies as their targets. And we are now moving to a more complex world. But in this more complex world, also the needed literacy by the citizens is one fundamental dimension if we want to keep freedom of speech and the liberties that make democracy intact in that process. And this field is quite problematic because regulations can be enacted from one year to the other or in a couple of months, but actually in the buildup of literacy that sustains democracy and freedom of speech tends to take longer, because usually to deal with this kind of situations, we are talking about a generation, we are talking about 20, 25 years. So the big question mark for which we don't have an answer is how do we enact the defense of liberties in the short term when regulation acts on the short term and people are being trained to do that in the medium long term. And in that part, I'm not actually that optimistic, and I agree with Nikolas, because the context in which we are living is quite a different context from the late 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. Because everywhere that we look, we have a narrative about war, about enemies, and that means that we are entering a field where usually we have to discuss, or it doesn't mean that we have to discuss, but some people are taking the liberty, between commas, to say, look, the rules, you are absolutely right about freedom of the press, about freedom of speech, but in times of war, there are some constraints, and we need to enact them. And so this is a narrative that you find everywhere, and probably it's more problematic even in Europe, because the US have, with all the problems and all the virtues that the US has, it has freedom of speech in a very broad approach in terms of its constitution, but Europe has a more bureaucratic approach. So it means that many times that you have in constitution, you have the enaction of the rules, but at the same time, you have a lot of different bodies that have quite the liberty to deal with that kind of situation. Of course, citizens that are awake can do the difference, but it's quite difficult to counteract a narrative of the enemy at the gates. And this means that we have a very problematic situation in terms of defining what is actually, what are you able to listen, see, comment, produce, because you are always having this idea that, look, there are barriers to this. There is a point from which you cannot go into, or you cannot depart from. And I think that's to bring a little more pessimistic approach. I think I will stop by now and give the floor to you.
And nothing of that started right now, and nothing of that started even with social media. So we had that polarizing effect even with the 24 hours news channels before. So polarization brings us to that that end that Gustavo was now talking about, and that polarization is favored by the way platforms build their business models. So there we have a problem, and targeted advertisement, or even the gathering of data from citizens, which is quite secret quite secret, without any kind of informed consent by citizens, is being pursued by these platforms, and polarization is growing, and it leads us to that situation. What do you think, Nikolas, is the effect of this, and do you see it as Gustavo, as the unresolved issue about regulation?
Well, yes, I think it's a big problem. And actually, for me, this is where the word literacy applies. For me, it's not about news literacy. I don't like the idea of news literacy, that we should educate people about the news, because for me, there is it's like implying that they should like the news that we like. It's like implying, and now I'm being a little bit provocative, not against the two of you, but against a general feeling in Europe ahead of the European elections, that because we don't like the result of an election, like Trump winning, Brexit, Le Pen, and so on, or because we are afraid of the upcoming result of the election, we should teach people to vote for the right thing. But I agree that literacy is very important, especially when it comes to the understanding of how information works. For example, one of the shocking things for me is that I have two kids, they're 18 and 19 years old, and my daughters are very freely, for example, give away their personal information. My daughters very easily, when they're on social media, they will share moments of their personal life and so on. I see that my generation is much more attentive, much more skeptical when it goes to that. And actually, it's a paradox, because the younger generation is much more literate than us old people. But there is no doubt that we need to explain to the people how this circuit of information works, and what is the danger there with target advertising, with practices like that, and so on. Going back a little bit to what Professor Cardoso said, I completely agree that we are now going in Europe into this new mentality that we are almost in a state of war, which means that this is an extra reason to restrict further freedom of speech and all that. For me, the irony here and my disappointment is who pushes for more freedom of speech and who pushes for more control over freedom of speech. And for example, I see the left being the power that wants more control over freedom of speech, and the right wanting more transparency. And this is a huge breach to a tradition of the left and the liberals in the West. And of course, I agree that the US, you can say so many bad things about the US political system, US society, but at least they have this wonderful thing, which is their utmost respect to freedom of speech and to the freedom to say whatever. But even in the US, if you watch closely over the last 8 years, this is changing a lot. I don't want to divert the conversation to other things, but I always like examples. And for example, my favorite, and I don't want to hijack the conversation, but it was like an agenda I wanted to throw in this example, and I was looking for some way to bomb the conversation with this example. My favorite example is always the Hunter Biden laptop example. A few weeks before the 2020 election between Biden and Trump, there is a story in the New York Post, very ancient newspaper, but not a very good one, that has leaked content from the son of Biden, who is the contender for the race, and this is out, and for the conservatives, of course, it's a big opportunity to influence the election because it will show that the Bidens are corrupt and the son of Joe Biden has corrupt dealings in Ukraine and all that. And what happens there, for me, it's completely shocking. The platforms intervene and they completely stop, they shut down the story. I cannot read the story because if I try to share the story with you, Paulo, it will be stopped. If I do it a second and a third time, my account will be sanctioned, will be deleted. The irony is that we now know that the story was correct. The laptop was owned by Hunter Biden. The content of it was Hunter Biden's dealing. It was not Russian disinformation, as a series of intelligence chiefs said in the news over those days to explain why the story should be shut down. So even in the US, we have this temptation to intervene in the public debate and to completely shut it down. That's why I'm being so skeptical. I won't talk more because I already hijacked the conversation a little bit.
I know, and I was expecting you to raise also the other important issue, which is Julian Assange, that is facing, well, something that we cannot imagine, which is to be arrested or home arrested or embassy arrested for many years now, and facing an abuse of freedom of speech court case in the US. But the point here is, I'm trying to give a hint to Gustavo to answer Nikolas. I'm joking. No, the problem here is that if you didn't have that, you would still have Elon Musk visiting Milei in Argentina, trying to fight Lula, and that was freedom, and that is freedom of speech, and that is freedom of press, because X has the proprietary power of an economic force that wants to shape information too. But Gustavo, the answer is yours. I'm just trying to put something in the middle.
We are on the, what we say, if it was a Gramscian approach, we are in the interregnum. So we are in the middle of a system that is no longer there, but the new system has not yet been built in that process. And so we have all these power confrontations going on. Economic, that has always been like that in terms of capitalism. It works like that. So it's about power. And even when it's not capitalism, even in what statism, we had also the same struggles in power in between the economy and the political elite in that process. But we are focusing on democracy because we want democracy to thrive, and we want to have a world where freedom of speech and the freedom to say whatever you feel like doing it in terms of the citizen, but also in terms of the media outlets. Because one thing that we have not addressed here is that if we want to have a strong democracy, we need journalism. And that is something, you can be a journalist in a non-democratic regime, but you won't have democracy because journalism there is also different. So this is the background. And the discussion here is, how can we have strong journalism and at the same time democracy in a world where we have platforms, citizens, journalists, and politicians in that process? And that is the tricky question, the difficult question, because we know that we need political power to enforce limits into economic power, the economic power of platforms. But at the same time, like Paulo was saying in the beginning, we have this dispute because of hegemony of platforms. So the US don't want to have a big platform coming out of China, and China wishes to defend its ability to have a big platform, because power relations in the world also have always been connected with information and communication, and to have a worldwide platform like TikTok is an important asset also for China, culturally, economically, politically, in terms of power in the world. So what follows? Well, the question is, can we have a system based in oligopoly and monopolies in terms of the world, in terms of the platforms, or should we do something about it? I believe that there is this tension in terms of governments in the US and also in Europe, trying to find out how do we balance that. For the US, it's quite important to have this dominion in terms of the platforms, in terms of Meta, in terms of Google, in terms of all the ones from entertainment, the ones from communication in that process. For Europe, we are in the middle. And so we have an opportunity to try to deal with this. And that's why we need the kind of regulation that faces those kinds of powers and opens up a little bit of space to breathe in terms of Europe, and to allow us as citizens to say, okay, we agree with this, but we want some limitation on what they are doing. I'm not very optimistic because these things tend to take time. And once again, the narrative about war messes up with everything. Because from the US point of view, say we have to protect our own companies, so we are not doing to them what we did to the telecom companies in the beginning of the 20th century. And even if they would do it, there is this discussion about, could it be done outside the borders of the US, or would it have effects only inside of the US? So this is also a brand new world in terms of this platformization of societies, and actually the leading that process of platformization, the US and China, and of course Russia, but that's another story because that's for the Russian-speaking world. And although they are big, they are not outside that area. In terms of China, they are. In terms of US, they are also. That's why Elon Musk nowadays can have opinions about what happens in Brazil. But look, this is what actually seems more strange to us is that we are living these processes. Because when we read about the same kind of things that happened on the beginning of the 20th century, of the late 19th century, about businessmen, at the time there were little businesswomen, businessmen that were actually running their relations with foreign countries outside the US as they were actually competitors or pieces of land to be bought and grabbed and as assets, not as countries made of citizens. So this is not a new trend. It's more strange for us because we are not used to that. But that's only a matter of how you actually position yourself as a powerful person like Elon Musk is. There is another, Nikolas was talking about his daughters, and that's also another important issue because we have culturally changed in society our own perception of reserve. I'm not talking about privacy. Privacy is for the law. Reserve is our own decision. What do we show of ourselves to others? And we have changed it completely, but that's not something new. It has not, for once, it has not that much to do with platforms. It started with journalism, focusing on building up people's fame, not because of what they did, but because giving them attention. It moved to the television reality shows that brought this idea that you had something to gain to show something about yourself, and then ended up on the platform. So this is something also that we have to acknowledge because there is this combination between surveillance from one side and competitive participation being evaluated, the likes and so on. So this is something that has changed also the way in which we relate to others and the way in which communication actually happens in our society. And that has also influence in the way in which we look to the freedom of speech. And probably the discussion of freedom of speech has to follow this path, that is to discuss celebrity processes in our societies in order to defend the freedom of speech and democracy. It might be a little bit strange for people that used to build the discussion from a theoretical perspective of the functions of democracy and the state, but probably if you want to be listened by people, you will have to move the discourse to another place and ask them, okay, you have this relation with fame, you also are aware that you are being constantly surveilled in that process. Are you okay with that? And actually, if you are okay with it, do you want to allow platforms to have such power over you that you won't be able to get the fame that you want in that process? It might be a little bit weird for older people to bring into the discussion, but it does make sense. And of course, that leads us to another discussion that focuses on both you, Paulo and Nikolas, which is, it might be the case that there is nothing wrong with the content of news. It's just the format of news, which is not adapted to the young people. For instance, what would we say if we would get the news on a GAUM approach? That is, when we look at TikTok, Go Out With Me, if you are doing your makeup and at the same time giving up the news on the day, would that be fine? Does that have a problem with democracy and freedom of speech, or building up in terms of the journalism audience that we need to build up for the younger generations? Or is it actually a solution from the process? Format, not content. And that is also, I'm bringing this to the discussion because it might be, this is an hypothesis, that the old ways that we have been practicing are not efficient enough to sustain journalism from one perspective, and at the same time to build a narrative of the importance of freedom of speech and freedom of the press overall.
That's very interesting, because my final question for you both would be, one of the reasons why journalism exists is to be, and it's already a very difficult concept when you are debating freedom of speech and freedom of press, but to be the frame of the public debate. So journalism would be that frame. So you would give people the important, relevant issues for them to make their own opinions on those. But we don't have a frame anymore, because now we are individualized in smaller bubbles of information or targeted content, targeted distribution of information. So is journalism even possible informing only these small identitarian bubbles, or does journalism need a larger audience, an open, a public opinion, as we used to call it in the old days? How do you see that, Nikolas?
Yes, I agree with both of you. And actually, there were some key phrases key words on what Professor Cardoso said, but also your word frame, because it's obvious we have a problem. We are not the frame anymore. We do not control the frame, and this is very disappointing for us from an egoistic point of view. We cannot control the debate, and actually, my reflection on that is, because we cannot control the debate, we so much rant about social media, and we want to regulate it and to restrict it, etc. The issue here is that, as Professor Cardoso said, moving discourse to another place. The problem is that the more we try to control and to restrict the frame and to restrict the flow of information, the more the discourse moves to another place. In our current societies, there is no way you can keep the discourse framed the way we like it. It will move to another place, and maybe this other place might be much, much worse. It might be the dark internet. It might be a platform that we don't like, not even TikTok. And actually, you can see that even from a political point of view, it is counterproductive, because you can see after all these years who is winning the political argument. The other thing is that, for example, and that's a true example, after our debate will be over with Reporters United in Greece, we are about to publish a big story. And I am already irritated when I see that this big story that I've been working with my friends and colleagues for months, it will be out there. And now we have to have a TikTok account and an Instagram account and everything, not just Twitter and Facebook. And then I will see on my feed on Instagram, and if I had TikTok also, that other silly things will have thousands and hundreds of thousands of views, and our so much important story for democracy in Greece will be tiny. But I don't think this is the fault of the platforms. I think this is our fault. I think to a big extent, especially in Greece, but also in Europe, we have lost the trust of the public because we did things wrong. It's not just that the public is indifferent because they are stupid and they're not literate enough. We did things wrong, and we have to restore trust. And of course, we have to readapt ourselves in the new format. And I wouldn't say that the new format is so bad. I can see wonderful things happening on TikTok from journalistic content, and the same with Instagram. But of course, it's very difficult for us to adapt in those new ways, to change our old ways, as you both said, with new ways. The problem, of course, is what Paulo said, the fragmentation. But this is also where journalism can play a role, because we have the temptation, because Trump won and we are in the opposite camp, and we know that we can make a lot of money just by thrashing Trump every day, that our whole coverage becomes very emotional, very sentimental. It's only about how bad Trump is, because we know this brings more views. So for me, the recipe is to go back to a journalism that tries to involve as many opinions and as many players as possible in the public discourse, instead of saying, this is my public, I will only speak to them. And I completely forget for something like 50 or 60 or 70 or 80% of the public opinion. And to do that, we have to reinvent the old ways, the very conservative ways of doing good journalism, but of course adapting to the new ways of the format. Anyway, again, I spoke too much, and please, Professor Cardoso, go on.
Okay, Nikolas, thank you. Paul, can I follow the question?
With just one small question that it's not a question for you to answer, but where I don't see what Nikolas goes to is because these new formats have their own limitations, and their own limitations about the complexities of issues. So you don't have the ability to do a very long analytical story if you need to shoot a 1.5 minute video for TikTok, or 100 characters for X. But Gustavo,
can I agree and disagree at the same time? Okay, so I agree with you. You cannot do it in such a limited time. But I also disagree about not being able to do it, because you can do it. If you look from a perspective of network communication, what means is that everything is connected. So imagine you have a brand. In TikTok, you do one thing. You link that to YouTube for a larger section of video. You also have your blog or web page for writing a lot. And add all the different things, they are all connected. The problem with this is that actually you have enacted the ability of everyone doing the same as journalists do, but being just one person, it's quite hard to do that and do everything at the same time. So you still need a number of people to work together in terms of journalist production, but it also means that they have to do it differently. And that is a big constraint, as usual. And our colleagues from management and economy of media explain why actually it's quite hard for media companies that are already in place to change, and they usually tend to fail in that change, and others have to appear and be there. This is a whole different discussion. This was just to agree and disagree. Now, about what Nikolas was saying and what you also asked previously, let's talk, what have we done wrong? In terms of what have you done wrong, it's a shared responsibility between academia, journalism, and actually media companies in that process. What I would argue is that we try to destroy a public sphere and replace it by a political sphere. We tried to change political opinion from public opinion to political opinion. What does this mean? In Portugal, it's quite easy to see, but the same trend happens everywhere. You have replaced the ability to have a public opinion, that is having people discussing everything, for formatting the discussion toward two-sided perspectives. One for and one against. And having done this, in the end, we have this proliferation of political commentary everywhere, and media companies always trying to get someone that will be for and someone that will be against it. And that's the format. So that's what we did wrong, and with the help of academia also many times. So this is what we have done wrong, and I believe that this is where we need to depart from to start doing it right. Another thing, probably in terms of journalism, we need an editorial perspective different from the past editorial approach. What does this mean? Well, actually, I think that we need to have this new job, which is someone that comes with this brand of trends editor. What does this mean? Well, actually is being always on the lookout to see what people are doing, either in TikTok or Instagram or elsewhere, the way in which you have trends being built up. Those kind of trends have to be hijacked into journalism. And this hijacked means that actually, it's like what we were discussing on going out and doing the makeup. It might be a totally different thing. It might be driving while you are saying a poem. And so if that works and everybody's doing that, you have to have journalists saying while driving the news. And it has to be like this because this is the only way. And it's going to finish and you're going to jump to the next one. This is just an idea to say that it's not possible to destroy the kind of communication that we have built. And we need to adapt it and mold it in order to be on the same side as the enhancement of democratic values in that process. And if we need journalism, we have to look at what is happening, what people are listening to in terms of format, and hijack it for the news at the same time. Because that's when people will start listening. Will it be enough? No, but it will be the teaser for the other things that you need people to look upon to. And I would like to say there has never been a golden age. The only reason why we had a golden age of journalism was because we only have a one-dimensional information sphere. Today we have a two-dimensional information sphere. We have those things that are only of interest for me and the people I know, and those things that come from journalism that are interesting for me and the people that I don't know. And there is today a huge imbalance in this process, being the things that interest me and the people I know. This means the platforms and whatever you produce, being a citizen, whatever you publish and whatever you share. And we need to rebalance that process. But this is a new world in that perspective, because we were not used to it. So the question has not been just about the real change was that we lost mediation from a small group of people that were journalists, and we have displaced it to everyone else. And in that process, we cannot lose the factual dimension, because that's fundamental for democracy. And that's the narrative that we need also to build. But at the same time, we cannot say you are all wrong, you have to listen to us, because what that kind of narrative and discourse brings is that people will say, no, you are wrong. So we have to bring it there, like we have always done. We have to bring them to listen to us, but in an effort, in a different kind of effort that has to be built in that process, because things have changed. Network communication is different from mass communication. And the kind of journalism that we need is different because we are no longer alone. Politicians, journalists, and citizens, we have the platforms that process. We need regulation. Yes, we need regulation. We need constitutional and political defense of the freedom of speech and freedom of press. Yes, we need it also. But we need also to change the perspective on how we look at citizens. And we need to start building new publics and not just thinking about how do we sustain audiences. Because to sustain audience means stealing from the other one right next door, the channel, the title, whatever. And young people actually are more far away than we were when we had their age in terms of the relation with news. And so we need to do something. This is my key point. We need to do something, actually.
And Nikolas, is it easy doing so when gadgets, and we didn't even go into the future of artificial intelligence, are so close to us, so corporeal, so integrated with our fingertips and our reasoning? Is it easy to do so, or we go back to what you said before about the consequences of losing privacy, and what do you think about it?
Well, I'm the wrong person to answer this because I'm completely addicted to my smartphone. I'm a sick person. I'm an ill person. But I think this is also an opportunity for journalism. And because I was the one in the panel with the darker, most pessimistic views about the future, and I completely agree with Professor Cardoso that there was never a golden age, things are not that bad. For example, Paulo, you mentioned the problem with the length of journalism, that now everything has to be short. But at the other side of the argument, we now have podcasts. We had completely forgotten about the idea that you can talk about over an hour about a subject and not for 3 or 5 minutes. We have a lot of new formats, and what you just said about the gadgets that can be used by journalism. For example, on the length of things, and without wanting to be provocative, probably the most successful podcast in the Western world is the Joe Rogan podcast, which, of course, the Democrats in the US would say he's a bad person because he's pro-Trump, etc. I'm a listener of his podcasts, and I want to tell you 2 things about the podcast. 2 is that they last 3 hours, each one of them, which shows that it's not about the length. It's not always about the format. And second, that the real virtue of his podcast is that he invites people from all the political spectrum. So there is a real debate there. And that's my point. The reason I want to have more freedom of speech is not only that I'm a good person, is also that it's good for journalism. It's good to go away from the polarized opinion that as news people we did for a lot of years, forgetting about the value of news. And for me, we can reinvent the value of news, but the difference is we must not do it by prohibiting and by dictating what is true and what is false, and what should be listened to and what should be read and what should not be read, but by producing good quality journalism that focuses on news with the old principles of journalism that cannot be replaced by citizen journalism or by TikTokers or whatever. So I still see a big opportunity for good journalism.
Thank you very much. We are going into the last minute of our hour of debate, and it's interesting what you just said, because one of the most surprising comments I've read for a long time was Noam Chomsky's interview to Matt Taibbi, where Chomsky argues that journalism now is much better than when he wrote his famous manufacturing consent book, although we have probably the biased opposite idea of it. Thank you very much, Gustavo and Nikolas. It was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you and learn with you. And thank you very much for the invitation. Index made us to be here debating something which is, at least for the 3 of us, very important. Thank you very much.
Paul.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Thank you both.